Welcome to another episode of Cavendish Talks. Today's episode is Battery Storage Unplugged, a discussion on attitudes towards battery energy storage systems. My name is Chelsea Riley. I'm an account director here in the Planning Comms team at Cavendish. We provide communications, engagement and consultation support to projects through the consenting process. Got a lovely panel of three here today and I'll just let them introduce themselves.
Thank you. My name is Neil Brooks. I'm Managing Director of Root Power. Root Power is a developer, owner, operator of battery storage systems, part of the Elam Energy Group, and we focus on standalone battery developments ranging from 10 megawatts to 100 megawatts in scale.
Hello, I'm Colin Turnbull, Planning Director at DWD Property and Planning. We're part of the RSK Group and we get planning permissions on behalf of a range of developers for batteries, typically in the sort of 50 megawatt sort of 1 gigawatt sort of space. We've been working with a number of developers for several years now. We've consented around 2.5 gigawatts of standalone batteries, and we also consent batteries co-located with solar.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Kwok. I'm a development project manager at RWE Solar and Storage UK. My day-to-day role is leading on the development of co-located solar and storage sites, but also standalone battery storage facilities. I suppose a bit of background about RWE. RWE are one of the largest energy producers in the UK, currently producing around 50% of the UK's electricity demand.
Fab, thanks everybody. So earlier this year, Cavendish undertook polling on public attitudes towards infrastructure. One of the questions we asked was, to what extent, if any, would you support or oppose the following? The results are shown on the slide here, and they seem to show overwhelming support for solar, with 87% of respondents indicating they would support solar development in their local area, compared with just 47% of respondents showing support for battery storage. Interestingly, around a third of people said they don't know if they support or oppose new storage projects in their area. This suggests there is more work to do in building understanding around and advocacy for battery storage. So, Colin, I'll come to you. What do you think of the research, and is this your experience of how battery is perceived by communities?
No, I think it's really valuable research, and for me the thing that sticks out is the don't knows. And actually there's a big comparison with the hydrogen. The data there is very, very similar percentages for the different categories there. These are two forms of development that are both relatively new. People don't quite know what they're agreeing to, I suppose. They won't always know what these things look like, why they're needed, and so on. So it's not surprising to me, but it does suggest that we need to do a lot more to convey what projects like this are going to look like, where they need to go, why they're needed, and how we've made them the best that we can.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think there's a difference here when you're talking about a standalone battery storage project versus that co-located with solar?
Certainly, yeah, because the solar projects, they can be well integrated with the landscape. So, the height of them, they do cover large land areas, so we have to integrate them with the landscape. It's really important that we do that. With battery, it's a little bit different because although they're on a smaller land area, they can be as tall. Problem being, you can't really put vegetation near to them. So what you do need to do is, make sure that they're well sited in your solar development. So in summary, integrating them into a solar development isn't actually a straightforward matter. You've got to think really carefully about it. With a standalone battery, you've probably chosen a site that's inherently suitable for it, rather than with solar, a site that's inherently suitable for solar. So you need to make sure that it's well mitigated, well separated from communities.
So Cavendish has been supporting RWE on the Pembroke battery project shown on the screen here. So this would see 350 megawatts delivered, and it is part of the Pembroke Net Zero Centre, a new hub of low carbon innovation and energy projects. The approach included a full public consultation with in-person events and online information, as well as stakeholder engagement, with over 90 feedback forms received from members of the community, and 82% said they supported the proposals in principle. But one of the misconceptions we heard during this project was around fire safety. Is this something you've come across, Ben, on the projects that you've been working on?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, I think it would be fair to say, probably with the experiences of other people on the panel, that fire safety is one of the most prominent questions that we get asked for either co-located sites or standalone sites. I'll probably start by saying that obviously the RWE Pembroke site itself is developed through a different generation company than what I'm sitting in. I work for the RWE Solar and Storage team, and this is being pushed forward by colleagues within RWE Generation. So whilst I can't speak too much about the granular detail of the feedback from which they received, I think it's fair to say they've obviously done a really good job in getting 90 feedback forms for a development of that size. This is obviously a really good result. And then 82% saying they support it in principle is also very, very high for the type of development. In regards to fire safety, it's a common question. We often get asked that from various different stakeholders, whether that's members of the public, whether that's councillors, parish councillors, whether that's ward members or even other affected groups from any type of development. Now, the issue around fire safety is a tricky one for me personally to kind of address in lots of ways, because I think it's very common for people in the industry to be quite reductive regarding fire safety and say that actually an opposition or an objection based on fire safety is because they don't understand the technology and how it works and how it functions. How I see it is that, well, that objection might hold true, but is that because of a lack of information being provided by a developer? Or is it because the actual information itself is too difficult to digest? Are we giving people the type of information they need that they can then make an informed judgment to either support or oppose any type of development? Fire safety is very emotive in kind of the language used for the type of risk. It often has connotations to explosions, fires, which you can't put out for days on end, is often something we get cited at us. And it's a theme which is running across development, which is being, at least in part, put forward by, I say, national groups who are looking to unpick certain applications, whether that is co-located or standalone.
Mm. So you touched on there some of the different reasons behind why this is arising, this misconception or misunderstanding. What do you guys think is the key to tackling that? What more can we do?
From my perspective, some of the recent direction of travel, I suppose, with the updating of the guidance from the Fire Chiefs Council goes a long way, although there are some areas where it seems to have taken some backward steps around spacing, for example, and spacing in adjacent objects to the development site. But I think there needs to be more top-down guidance, and then I think there needs to be a push, certainly, for resources to be made available within the local authorities, in particular the fire and safety rescue services. It can be quite challenging as a developer to get engagement with them at a pre-application stage, especially if your plans are early stage and you may not necessarily understand which technology you intend to use at that early stage. But even post-application, since they're not a statutory consultee, there can be applications where they are not consulted, or it is the developer who is pushing the planning officer to consult with the fire service and to get their feedback. And so I think there certainly needs to be more guidance, but the nature of the variety within the sector, the scale of the projects, I mean, that's a very large project. There are much smaller projects. There's a lot of technologies out there on the market. There are historic technologies that are still only a couple of years in operation that are unrecognisable to modern technology that's being deployed. So guidance is one part of it, but certainly I would say a greater emphasis on resources being made available to allow developers to consult in that application phase would be key for me.
Yeah. Anything to add to that?
No, I'd agree with Neil on the most part in terms of that top-down, more prescriptive guidance. There are so many international standards as well, for which, as developers, we'd probably have to adhere to anyway, or we'd like to adhere to for whether that's insurance purposes or the likes, or through manufacturers' recommendations for procurement. But again, I think as a team, we did a bit of a reflective exercise where we looked at around 20 different standalone batteries up and down the country, and looked at the type of information they were providing, in particular on fire safety. And I think that it's fair to say that there is a level of assumed knowledge from developers. I think we need to break it down. I think we need to make it simpler. What is a battery? What is it actually comprised of? People often describe it as they look like shipping containers, which is great in terms of a visual kind of connotations of what that is. but what are they made out of? What is the makeup of them? And I think once we can get into the very simple bits of information going back to communities and then understanding how they can take that on board, that's also a really good key part of making a meaningful relationship with various stakeholders.
I agree, and I think some of the best content that I've seen is when it's just compared to your mobile phone. And you take it home, you pop it on charge, and then later in the day when you've left the house and you need it, it then starts to use the power that you've already put in. So
on fire safety, I think planners have a key role to play. So this is a very classic sort of planning competency of applying spatial knowledge of an area to determining what kind of solution you need, what kind of mitigations you need. A brownfield site near to a power station where some of the batteries I've worked on have been will already have adequate supplies of water, they'll be level, they'll have all kinds of attributes that make them inherently suitable for battery. Some other projects will be on greenfield. You need to think about where the vegetation is, keeping away from boundaries and so on. The National Planning Practice Guidance is very clear that it's siting, access and a layout that's safe that matter at the planning application stage. And as planners, we need to sort of really help communities and also fire and rescue services through the process of understanding what goes into the application, what we can agree to now, and what goes as a planning condition to be dealt with later when we've chosen the technology provider. So I think there's a really key role for planners to take people through that process, because as Neil says, it's not especially clear why, it's not clear to me, for example, why fire and rescue services are not a statutory consultee, but they're not, and we need to help them and help communities understand how we make these things safe.
And sorry, Colin, just on top of that as well, I think often there's almost a neglect in terms of the type of information that you would provide. Battery safety management plans are fundamental, in my opinion, to providing the requisite level of information and staging, as you say. Now, how we approach battery safety management plans is to have almost an adherence checklist to the NFCCC guidelines. And it wasn't written by me, it was written by an engineering colleague. I can't claim to take any kudos for that. But what that does is it walks through fire and rescue service personnel who most of the time don't have a huge amount of experience in dealing with these types of technologies. They are firefighters through and through, and in speaking with them, they will happily admit that. They will say that they don't know a huge amount about these specifics, and they will happily just relay what the NFCC have provided to them. So it's almost like a checklist. It's getting them to the point where you can be comfortable there, and they're comfortable with that information at that stage, and then providing more detailed answers to follow once the development has either gained consent or not.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, guys. So we've talked about fire safety. What other misunderstandings or misconceptions are there that impact the success or challenges around battery storage projects?
Yeah, I think fire safety is definitely the number one challenge, particularly for standalone developments, because it does influence the spatial layout and characteristics of the development itself, whether that is providing dual accesses, whether that's where you're siting things on top of. But from kind of speaking to various stakeholders and actually engaging with them and kind of being on the ground, often the other key topics which are raised, at least to me, centre around noise and kind of any noise impacts, the tonality of the noise which might emanate from a battery storage container facility, and what that impact might be on them as a local receptor. Landscape concerns are also fairly prominent too. As Colin was saying at the start, battery developments tend to be different in solar developments in terms of how you can mitigate any changes to the character or the wider area. But those would be my top three, I think: fire safety, noise and landscape.
Anything missing from your top three there, Colin?
I think that's spot on. I mean, with all the fire safety side of things, we have to explain how firefighting supplies can be provided, how they can be contained if necessary. So the whole topic there involves showing how we're going to not only protect people's safety, but protect the environment. And I wouldn't call them misconceptions, but there's understandable concern about how you would deal with an incident in the very unlikely event that it took place. So, you know, that's a big area for planning these projects.
Thank you. Anything to add?
From my perspective, again, experience gained from public consultations, there's a challenge on developers, I think, communicating the benefits, and I think the benefits of battery storage tend to be on a larger national sort of abstract scale, which is not always that important when you're impacting a local community with your development. And unlike, say, developments such as onshore wind or large-scale solar, where there is dedicated community funds and the technology is much more fundamentally understood, with battery storage it can be a challenge. We have found the success comes from describing it as more like critical infrastructure rather than power generation, more like a substation or an overhead line, as it's part of the network rather than a type of power generation. But I do think that's a key battle with locals, local residents who are impacted by these developments. It's incumbent on the developers to set out what they are, and obviously there's always an option for a developer to have their own dedicated sort of community fund, but you know, that's a key message to get across in my experience.
Fabulous, thank you. So going back to visual impact, impact on local communities, host communities, how can projects and the industry challenge this and build trust in the technology as well? Two different bits there.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think I'd go back to kind of some of my earlier answers around the type of information that you're providing. I think for landscape in particular, what I've seen work really well is provide CGIs. So not really a montage, a visual montage, certified, verified montage that you'd have as part of the technical information to support a planning application, but actually just CGIs. Like what does this look like in practice? And that, again, I think as Neil was saying, grounds the conversation of what a battery storage facility looks like. People know what a solar panel looks like, they know what a wind turbine looks like, but I'm still not convinced that people actually can appreciate what a battery storage facility does appear like, even from, again, kind of the dimensions of it, to the colour which might be chosen, and all of the associated infrastructure that might be associated with that. So I think it's definitely the starting point is to reduce it down and kind of think about what information might be useful to the general public, and then obviously hit everything else you need to provide as part of the planning application.
Yeah, I agree. And on your point around, you know, people aren't familiar with it, and that comes back to the slide we were showing where it's a third of people aren't sure. I think people have made their minds up on solar, and people have made their minds up on wind farms and such, whichever way they go. But I don't think we, as general population, are as familiar as we need to be with this technology.
I think the technology it covers a broad range of scale as well. There are developments regularly now, several hundred megawatts in size and several hours worth of duration, which are substantial developments, typically connected, say, at transmission. But there are also smaller scale developments, such as at Root Power, where we cover from 10 megawatts to 100 megawatts in size, that are relatively modest by comparison. But the sort of the media is dominated by these much larger developments, and in some cases controversy around them. So when there is a public notice made about a particular development in a particular area, the mind jumps to those huge scale developments. I agree as well with that taking that extra step to create things like 3D renders or video montages is something that we've adopted on all of our projects as a result of the feedback that we receive, for example, at planning committees and local public consultations, as a way of communicating the application better rather than just providing the information. So yeah, I think every development can be have its visual impact mitigated to some extent through landscaping and by positioning it with existing screening features, you know, hedgerows, whatever. But I think that's quite difficult to convey to someone who doesn't necessarily understand what the development will look like at the outset. So, you know, that would be my key way of mitigating the impact.
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
And I mean, on visual impacts, another thing that the solar industry has done for a long time, and which I think the battery industry is starting to do, is to look at what the impacts upon near neighbours will be like, and then go and meet with them one-to-one at the beginning. So, you know, before you've even gone to a public consultation event, you know, go and meet your near neighbours, or, you know, see what kind of impacts they could experience from this project and go and deal with those impacts, then go and meet them and then go to consultation. Because if you can deal with those issues early on through the placing of your development and your screening, then the chances are that your consultation event can focus on maybe what the wider area thinks about the project and conveying some of these important messages around safety and layout, access, and why we need the battery.
Yeah, early engagement is crucial, I think, for success of any project like that.
Yeah, most definitely. But just on that near neighbour meeting, I think that's probably the most important thing that developers can do for batteries and co-located solar more broadly. I mean, it's very easy to look at a planning constraints map and say that, in theory, you think that the key topics that will be brought up at consultation are X, Y, Z. It's never the case. It's always the lived experience of people who actually surrounding a site or closest to the site and what they think it is. And I think for me that kind of almost goes full circle back to fire safety. And we talk about the actual risk of fires on battery storage developments being incredibly low. Statistically they are. And if you speak to those people who are proximate and have concerns around that, you can relay that information, but that doesn't necessarily catch, it doesn't necessarily fetch. And that's because of their kind of social construct of what that actual risk is. It's almost taking away kind of that objectivist kind of approach to what risk can be, and it's taking it out. And the only way to do that is near neighbour meetings and actually speaking with people, because otherwise you're stuck in this kind of feedback loop. And I've seen developers do this time in, time out, where they'll be like, they'll get to planning committee, for example, and it will get refused. And the committee will just go completely against officer recommendation, and they'll say, well, it's fine, they didn't understand, the committee didn't understand. Well, did they not understand, or was it that any kind of objectives managed to feed through into the councillors and their communication strategy was actually more effective than yours as a developer? And obviously that's a hard question to ask, because that takes a bit of kind of you as a developer looking at it in a bit more of a round and thinking, well, how can we make things better, rather than just going with the flow, doing things as a tick box, hold a public consultation just so you can write about it in your SCI. Like, how can we make engagement actually meaningful and to deliver a good project?
Yeah, absolutely, agree. So the challenges that we've been discussing, do you find it's experienced differently when we're talking about community representatives? So is it, when we've talked about it from the perspective of communities and local residents, does that translate across into your parish councils, your ward members, your planning committee members? Any thoughts, Colin?
Parish councils are a really important forum to go and meet with, and again, you know, maybe it's around the time that you're meeting with near neighbours, you can go and meet with the parish council and explain the site that's been chosen and introduce yourself as the developer and explain why this site's been chosen and understand how they'd like to engage, because you know they will hold regular meetings. You want to be meeting with them before this goes to planning. So you know, we found them a really important forum to go and meet with, and you will hear unvarnished, you know, what local concerns are going to be, and that will help you plan a meaningful consultation.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience as well, in addition to local political leaders like parish councillors or MPs, trying to access community groups can be quite important. They almost always are inevitably in attendance at public consultations, for example. But that's an example of an area where these developments can bring local benefit if there can be some kind of participation or support of a local community group. It might be something as simple as restoring a deteriorated public right-of-way, or it might be a local charity group that is specifically set up for the purpose of reaching out to developments to see if they will contribute to their activities. I think one aspect which is becoming more and more of an issue is the cumulative impact of developments, and in particular for battery energy storage and solar, it's such an attractive space for investment currently that the number of developments that are ongoing across the UK are substantial, and in some cases the cumulative impact of those developments is resulting in a level of fatigue in both the planning committees but also with the local residents. And so you'll often find that frustration comes through, and I think engaging in particular, as I say, with the community groups as well as with the public and the local leaders is really important.
So from a planning point of view then, do you think there's a difference, what's coming through from officers, and is that different to the concerns that are coming through from members, for example? What are the key issues that are arising through the planning process?
I mean, the planners ultimately are following the national and local plan, and they're assessing the application on the merits of the submission, and that can be quite a matter of fact and quite a factual process. The challenge, I suppose, comes when there's an element of controversy. For example, if the development is in the green belt, or if it is an area of natural beauty, or near to an area of natural beauty, or near to areas that are of some kind of heritage significance, and that's where it becomes much more subjective, and where we are regularly seeing that the route to successful application is going through appeal, as the easiest option for those participating in the decision is to reject it and expect the developer to appeal. I think that's a key issue with these developments, and working in the space as these guys do. The frequency that successful appeals you get visibility of successful appeals is quite alarming, because it is becoming the default route. So planners, I think, generally are, provided there is no material planning constraints and it's not a controversial development, they are generally supportive, especially if the developer has done a good job of preparing the application and has met the criteria and done the surveys and so on. The committees, I think the default is tending to be refusal. That's not the ideal way for these projects to progress, considering the national sort of significance of them.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so thinking about the need for battery and the benefits that it could bring about, do you think the public and local councillors understand the need for battery storage as part of in the context of net zero?
Sorry, I don't think we're both allowed to start then. No, is the very short answer.
I thought I could see no coming. I saw it.
I think there's lots of ways to kind of tackle that question and unpick it. I think just to go on what Neil was just saying about planning committees and kind of refusals at planning committees, I spoke to a case officer maybe last year, it might have been the year before. There was a nearby standalone battery development to our co-located sites, and I saw that it got refused at committee, and I just asked him, I was like, what happened there? What was your read on that? And he was extremely clear. He said the committee do not see the value in standalone batteries, but they could, and they have a track record for co-located solar and storage sites. And I think that was really telling, in that if those working in that industry, working within that realm, cannot unpick the need, then that there must be underlying issues there. Now, I think at the national level, there's obviously mandated targets for solar, for example, that we are looking to deliver on. There isn't really the same with battery storage. There's kind of looser goals and aims at which we can strive to go for, and those aren't really being updated and refreshed by the government as we'd like. Now, that would be amazing if Ed Miliband was able to do that and kind of pick up that piece. Obviously, there's a lot of consultation material coming out with the change of government, and that was almost a glaring omission, at least to my mind, was around this need for storage and clarity, again, on some of the guidelines to which we should be prescribing to for fire safety and other key topics, which would then, in their own right, help to release the pipeline of storage rather than going through planning by appeal.
Yeah. Colin, did you want to come in there?
Well, I was going to add, I mean, the Labour manifesto contained a pledge for a net zero electricity system 5 years sooner than the previous target, so from 2035 to 2030. That's a major, major difference. So if you're going to deliver that, we need to be matching renewable deployment with electricity storage. There are other ways of balancing out the demand between intermittent renewables and what's needed. There's all kinds of smart uses of the grid that we can achieve. We can turn on some gas power stations every now and then, but that's not not going to be a major part of a net zero electricity system. So we do clearly need quite a lot of battery on the system by 2030. Now, once you start looking at how long that will take to build, how long it takes to consent, you can see why we are in a busy period. So, we don't have gigawatt targets. I think there's 4.7 gigawatts on the system now. There's lots and lots of gigawatts in the planning process, but there's a lot more we could do, and the need does need to be articulated on every application at the moment, because it's not really being articulated clearly at a national level.
Yeah.
And I suppose just linked to that need and how we can address that in the application. I think one thing that we've noticed that's gaining traction across stakeholders is expanding the natural scope of a planning application. And I don't say that lightly, because I think it can become burdensome and you don't necessarily need a gold standard for every single application you put in. But in terms of actually trying to get this across as an information piece, obviously Colin's touched upon some of the net zero and wider strategic benefits of battery storage in particular. But there's also lots of spin-offs which aren't necessarily articulated within the majority of planning applications. Economic benefits, for example, business rate generations, hardly ever mentioned in battery storage developments, but always mentioned in solar, and they're very comparative amounts. So pull that out in an economic benefit assessment, start teasing these things out. There's also a lack of discussion around what the function of a battery can actually do to help us to get to net zero in terms of reducing curtailment on the wider network. That is quantifiable. It's really difficult, but it is quantifiable. And then by doing that, you'd be able to look at offset carbon emissions from a 20 megawatt standalone asset and what it can actually do to lower regional emissions at any given point, looking at kind of historic carbon emissions related to energy generated for a year previous, for example. There are ways of doing it. I think in doing so, you can get to a stronger benefit case again in order to overcome these hurdles.
So, Neil, is there a challenge with local benefits?
Yeah, I think there's a challenge with communicating what the benefits are. National benefits are easy to communicate. Most people tend to understand them. The need to support renewable growth through energy storage and flexible power generation. Touching on what Ben mentioned, there are other benefits of battery energy storage, and it's difficult to convey. But usually, if you describe the fact that we're trying to do more with the same amount or more with less, people start to understand it. So battery energy storage can be used fundamentally as a technology to reduce the need for new infrastructure, to reduce the need for new substations, new overhead lines, new major energy projects, because we are using the same energy locally. If they're connected to the distribution network in particular, we're storing the energy that's generated locally, often importing it from the same GSP where another renewable technology might be generating it into, and that inherently reduces the need and the congestion on the network.
Thank you. So looking to the future then, Colin, is the planning system fit for purpose for battery storage projects, battery storage development?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it is fit for purpose, just about. I also am quite a realist, and I think it's what we're stuck with. We did have batteries within the NSIP regime, so that's nationally significant infrastructure projects. So you used to have to get a development consent order to build a battery over 50 megawatts. That got removed, so this is where we've ended up. I think one of the major things we do need is better support in the National Planning Policy Framework. So there is a consultation on till the 24th of September, and there's been positive words about renewable energy in the NPPF, and that's really important policy. Ed Miliband's government have strengthened this, but there's still no recognition of energy storage, batteries, and the role they play. And one of my projects recently, we got told by a local authority that it wasn't renewable or low carbon development, and that's the wording in the NPPF. We disagreed, but it left us with a bit of a problem. So we do have actual examples of the NPPF text not being helpful, and if we're going to bring this net zero electricity system target to 2030, then through this consultation I think it's really important that we make clear what new wording we want in that policy, because it just, to me, it's a clarification. We all know that batteries are essential to a renewable and low carbon energy system. So So that's the bit that I think we need.
Is there anything that you would add to that?
No, I would agree that it is just that need. I think it's thinking about almost what kind of changes we'd want to see as part of that consultation. There were a few thoughts internally, and this isn't a formal RWE response to the consultation, just as a sideline. But you could, in theory, change a footnote, for example, on what is classified as renewable and low carbon development in the NPPF. I think it's page 83 or 78, it's one of them. But in doing so, you'd almost bring forward all of the justification and policy support for solar, and that would apply equally to battery storage. In doing so, you'd also help to, I guess, expedite battery storage developments which are in the green belt and establishing the BSC for that. I think there can be some really, really low interventionist approaches to this rather than wholesale changes to the NPPF, which would in itself cause a bit more uncertainty than perhaps we would like as an industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And Colin's right, we need that presumption to change if we're going to hit the net zero targets. Battery's essential to that. Coming over to you, do you think, Neil, that Greenbelt is appropriate for battery storage projects?
I think it's a big question. I think there's a number of aspects to it. Not all Greenbelt is equal. I think each individual application should be considered on its merits. I think given the congestion on the network, on the distribution network in particular, as we've last 10 or 15 years or so, we've transitioned to power generation on the distribution network, it has become clear that that infrastructure, which was never really designed for power generation, requires major overhaul. And the reason I would say there's a high frequency of applications for this technology and solar in the Greenbelt is because the substations, the GSPs, the points of connection on the network are themselves in the Greenbelt. Developers have been pushed further and further out of these urban centres to site these technologies, and in the case of solar, it's kind of inherent given the space that you need, and that has resulted in a greater frequency of projects in the Greenbelt. Is it appropriate? I think the consistent view of the planning inspectorate is that the benefits outweigh the harm. That's not quite the same as saying that it is appropriate development in the Greenbelt, but I think it's an inevitable direction of travel for this technology.
And just staying with you for a moment, what about the need to deliver biodiversity net gain for battery storage projects?
Yeah, it's a multifaceted issue with the recommended spacing, the recommended routes of access for these developments, coupled with the requirement for screening, coupled with the requirement for BNG, on-site BNG, which is the preferred BNG solution. The scale of these developments is increasing. Even the smaller developments are becoming larger and larger, which impacts the developments in the case of tipping into things like environmental impact assessment applications. And so BNG, I think, is a complicated topic, partly probably because of its newness, but there are other issues around things like what happens at the end of the term of the development to the BNG that has been located on site. What happens if habitats have been created over that 30-year period? The guidance is helpfully unhelpful in that it just says it is for the planning officers to determine the duration of, for example, biodiversity net gain habitats that are created. And so I think it's an area that will evolve. And what we've become aware of is where on-site biodiversity net gain is not possible for whatever reason, obtaining off-site credits is a complicated and difficult thing to achieve, and it's an area that the individual planning authorities don't seem to have clear guidance on how to deal with it. In some cases, it's dealt with as, say, a Section 106 agreement, and in some cases it's more open-ended. So I think it's an area that will evolve, and it has to evolve, for these developments to go ahead at the rate that they need to.
Thank you. So, Colin, do you think, what other blockers have we got? So we've got a clear mandate from government that this needs to happen, but it seems to be as we get down to each specific project, there are blockers in the way. Are there any blockers that we haven't talked about already?
I suppose one potential blocker could be access. So, bringing these batteries and the transformers in to sites and maintaining them does require generally HGVs, heavy goods vehicles. So finding a site that has suitable access, and like Neil's mentioned, you need the twin accesses for the fire service. That's what they expect. So, getting all that built in at an early stage is going to be really important when you're finding a site, and you might want to be looking at junctions quite far away and seeing how they're going to perform, seeing what the geometry is like on those. So there's a bit of a piece on access that all developers are looking at.
Okay. Anything from you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on quite a lot already. I think standardised guidelines for everything would be great, fire safety in particular. Establishing the need case, maybe just a more general planning point. Fund LPAs to the level that is required. Appreciate that we've got some notion from government as to what they think is acceptable, but perhaps it's a decent amount more than that. But again, that's not specific to batteries, that's just more anything within that planning system.
Yeah, for sure. It certainly is having an impact. Is there anything else you'd ask of the government?
It's whether or not you think there's merit included in it. One of the issues on the horizon, I think, partly as a consequence of the fire safety, partly as a requirement of evidencing the fire safety, is that developers are having to become more and more specific about the technology that they propose to use. Many developers have not specified the technology at the application stage, but when you couple the issues or the challenges in getting a grid connection in the sort of near future and the constraints on the network with the requirement to be much more specific as to what technology you're expecting to deploy, it starts to create an issue around flexibility of these developments. And be realistic about it. Many of these developments are developed to be sold on to someone else, or perhaps the developer does not intend to build the project themselves but sell it to another developer to construct. And that point around flexibility around those developments is a major issue. If we're talking about a battery energy storage project which is consented in, say, 2025, it may not be built until 2030, as that may be the requirement when the reinforcement, the necessary reinforcement has been complete. Just think about how much the battery storage technology has evolved in the last 5 years, and how likely it is that it will change. And just moving away from planning onto sort of markets, we've seen that, for example, in the 2030s, 4-hour duration storage will become far more attractive and will become almost the norm. And so unless there is a corresponding halving of the size of the technology over time, these developments will start to need more space to be viable. And so, that's an issue that I don't really think is addressed currently. We are being asked to provide very specific detail about the technology, and to evidence its safety and provide things like the UL testing of the cells, assuming we are building these projects as perhaps we used to in the next 12 to 18 months. And that's just not realistic these days. It's just not realistic. And so that is something that needs to be addressed, and it's to be seen how flexible planning authorities will be in the future when developers attempt to amend and vary these consented developments as they finalise on their selected technology.
So by the time they build them out, the technology will have moved on. So what you're putting in the ground is going to look different to what you're putting in your proposal as things stand.
Certainly there's the risk that will be the case. It depends, but as I say, 5 years ago it was 30-minute or 1-hour duration energy storage, typically in 40-foot shipping containers, internal spaces. That's almost unheard of now in developments, and that was only a few years ago. If you assume that same trend of evolution of the technology will continue, it poses a risk for these developments and their flexibility, for sure.
Thank you very much. So final question then, and I'm coming over to you, Ben. Yes. Thinking about community benefit, anything to close on that?
Yeah, sure. Again, I think it's one of those, not necessarily issues, but it's something which probably divides the developers who work in the space. Now, RWE operate co-located solar and storage sites, but also standalone sites. Now, the co-located sites, there's already a fair understanding, I think, of what a community benefit fund value might look like per megawatt, roughly. There's lots of work with the industry body to get to a point of agreement with government, and that was paused by the election, but it's still ongoing. But I think there's an acceptance that a community benefit fund should be provided. For batteries, I'm not sure that is the case. Again, I reflect on some of the alternative sites that were put to our attention from other developers and looking at whether a community benefit fund was advertised. Very few at all. we're talking in any kind of realm of community benefit, and I assume that it would be the case that they wouldn't look to develop a community benefit fund for standalone technologies. Now, community benefit funds in themselves are very peculiar because they're obviously detached from planning. They're not given any weight in the planning balance for good reason, but they are, at least to my mind, a really important part of signalling to the local community that yes, we are coming into your local environment, we will be constructing, operating and developing a project here. And it's almost a nod to that kind of long-term engagement, meaningful relationship with these stakeholders. And I think we're potentially at a bit of a dangerous position in that if communities can't understand and appreciate the wider national benefits of battery storage, the level of information provided at a planning application stage doesn't itself evidence things such as job creation, business rates generation and the likes, other economic benefits. People are struggling on delivering biodiversity net gain and everything around that. And then we're not providing a community benefit fund. We're almost not providing the community with any reason to support a project. And I think, at least in our experience of pushing these out, we would always look to deliver some type of community enhancement, community benefit within the actual, associated area of a site, if possible. But if not, we would definitely be looking to provide some support to the wider community in terms of a fund. I think it's a really key tenet of developing these sites.
Great, thank you. Big thanks to our panel for taking the time to join us today, and thank you to all of our viewers who have tuned in. You can contact us by using the details that are in the chat.